First things first, if you aren't familiar with how magic works in Anima Beyond Fantasy, you'll want to get the hang of that first. Everything in Arcana Exet builds off that. Another thing worth noting is that this book is based off the 2nd edition rules, which uses a different method for ability rolls than the English core book, which was based off the 1st edition. The 2nd edition uses a much more intuitive method, where you roll a d10 and add your ability score, and you're going to try to meet or beat a target number. It's not really explained in Arcana Exet what numbers correlate to what difficulty, but 10 seems to be a pretty safe average difficulty to start from. Another thing this book gives you is some setting information regarding the history of magic, such as why magic is rare now, as well as an in-setting lexicon for magical terms. There is also an explanation of what summoning is, and why it can only be used to bring otherworldly creatures into reality, and not just about anything. The bulk of this book, though, is some additional systems that give more options to magic users, and let me tell you, it gives you a lot. The first, and what I consider the most important update, is that there's a new way to gain spell levels. Normally, it's based off your character's intelligence, and that's it. The only way you could get more would be to somehow raise your intelligence. Arcana Exet, though, comes with rulings for another way to get more spells. Spending your development points. They come in a 1-for-1 basis, and you have to spend at least 5 development points every time you opt for this. So spending 20 development points gets you 20 spell levels, and if you wanted more, you need to spend 5 more development points. There's 2 other limitations to this method. Only 10% of your total development points can be used for gaining spell levels, and points spent this way count towards supernatural development. So if you're a level 1 warlock who already spent 250 points on magic accumulation and magic projection, you're only allowed to spend 50 more points on spell levels, since only a total of half of your points are allowed to be spent on spellcasting related things. Another option you have is to spend your development points on the ability to raise your Xeon regeneration. The way this works is you can buy an accumulation multiple that is only used when calculating how much Xeon you regenerate per day. This multiple costs half the normal amount of development points. So for an illusionist, one of these multiples that raises Xeon regeneration would only cost 30 development points, half of what you would normally pay as an illusionist. If you don't want to spend development points to improve your Xeon regeneration, there is one other option they add. If a character spends half of a given waking day meditating, and the other half doing no strenuous activity, they can add their willpower bonus to how much Xeon they regain. There is also a new ability that summoners get. They can increase the amount of creatures they can affect if the creatures in question are comparatively weak. This chart from page 10 of Arcana Exet summarizes the conditions that need to be met, and it boils down to this. The more you want to affect, the higher level you have to be, and then the roll is made as if the creatures were so many more levels higher than they normally are. And to top it all off, the amount of Xeon a character would need to spend is then doubled. Summoners also have the option of specializing in invocations only. Doing this means you can never summon supernatural creatures. Invocation is the only thing you can do with your summoning ability. You can still use other summoning related abilities such as Control, Bind, and Banish though. The plus side to taking this specialization is that you only need half the amount of Xeon to use invocations. Since this rulebook adds a lot of things that power up magic, it's also worth noting that there's a few new rules that nerf spellcasting. The one I'd recommend including is the rules for running low on Xeon, the magical energy needed to cast spells. If you go below 50 Xeon, you immediately lose 2 points of fatigue and gain a -10 penalty to all actions. And this -10 is in addition to any penalties from losing fatigue as well. If you manage to lose all of your Xeon, this suddenly jumps up to losing half your maximum fatigue, and the penalty jumps up to -30. You regain your lost fatigue and the penalty goes away once you manage to raise your Xeon to 50, so it's not so damning if you have a reliable way to regain Xeon. Additionally, these penalties don't affect characters who have less than 50 maximum Xeon and are currently at their maximum Xeon. It does mean, however, that once that person with 50 Xeon loses it, they are immediately affected. Additionally, you can make it so that a character can only learn new spells if they spend time studying. I'm not a big fan of learning times in games, so this is one I'd personally skip. Basically, you have a learning level, which is based on how many spell levels you've used thus far. There's various factors that increase this level too, such as having an instructor, being a master of the occult skill, and having a relevant book on the matter if an instructor isn't present. When you have your learning level, you check this chart for the level of the spell you want to learn, and that's how long it would take to learn it. This book also gives you a few new advantages, some of which make use of the other things added in this book, and others that can be used on their own. My personal favorites for this are Incomplete Gift, a weaker version of the Gift Advantage, and Gradual Magic Learning, which gives you 5 spell levels each time you level up. The second chapter introduces new spellcasting systems that deviate from what was presented in the core book. These are called Theorems of Magic. They all use the same paths and spell lists, but for most of these, they add some other step or dimension to the process. This change usually comes with both some kind of advantage and disadvantage. I'll spend the next few moments summarizing them. Omyodo is the theorem where spells are prepared ahead of time on scrolls or talismans called Ofuda. There's an additional skill roll that needs to be made before the spell is prepared, with difficulties and penalties applied based on the level of the spell and the time spent preparing, respectively. You spend half the Zeon needed for that spell at creation, and you're unable to regenerate that Zeon until the spell is cast or the talisman is otherwise destroyed. However, this then means you only need to accumulate half the amount of Zeon needed when you actually cast the spell. Additionally, anybody who can use Ofuda can use anybody else's Ofuda, regardless of who originally created it. The drawback, though, is that anytime you try to cast a spell without an Ofuda, you double the Zeon cost of that spell, and you cannot cast that spell at a higher level effect than normal. Vudan is based on the idea that all things have an unseen connection to one another, and as a result, all of its advantage are tied to spiritual spells. Simply put, having certain objects related to the target, referred to as links, make it more difficult to resist its effects, and these effects are cumulative. Another effect that Vudan gets to use is that they can forgo using a particular link to make a spell more difficult, and instead automatically hit with the spell. Doing this, though, gives the target a plus 40 bonus to resist. Other links you have can still be used to compensate by raising the difficulty the target needs to beat, though. The drawback to Vudan is that it's not meant to be offensive. Any attack spell used by a practitioner of Vudan only deals half damage. In Anima, shamanism refers to a theorem of magic that relies on the use of ambient spiritual energy to assist in spellcasting. In game terms, this means that certain areas are easier to perform magic in, or more difficult. These are referred to as spiritual zones. Most places in the world are considered normal spiritual zones. They allow the shaman to use magic more or less normally. In a stronger spiritual zone, spells might deplete only half the Zeon that would normally be used, or in a weaker one, spellcasting might even be impossible. If a shaman has Zeon to spend, though, they can gather that and spend it to bring spirits into the area, and improve the level of that spiritual zone. Additionally, the shaman's relationship to the spirits in a zone may help or impede the shaman's spellcasting. The only real drawback to shamanism is that under no circumstances can a shaman use necromancy. It simply won't happen. If for some bizarre reason you wanted to use magic without being restricted by spells, natural magic is what you're looking for. Natural magic isn't really a theorem of magic. It's kind of a wild and unpredictable method of just using raw energy to create spell-like effects. It's somewhat weaker than the structured method of using spells, and oddly enough, you still need the gift in order to use it. Using natural magic follows these steps. First, the player describes what effect they want to the GM. The GM then decides what level of effect that would be, and determines the base challenge rating for creating that spell. There are other factors that modify that difficulty, such as how far off or how long the spell will last, and even how much Zeon they're willing to spend to help the spell casting. Then you roll the power attribute to see if you succeed. The good side to natural magic is that there's no limitation to what you can accomplish, at least in theory. In practice, there's a lot that can go wrong. Whenever you use natural magic, there's a wide variety of side effects that can happen, ranging from loss of fatigue or Zeon, to even the character fainting and permanently losing points in their power attribute. Additionally, no effect from natural magic can last more than a day, and a particular effect cannot be used more than once per day. Furthermore, if a character knows spells or has developed magic projection, they suffer a -4 penalty to the power roll for using natural magic. What magic splat book wouldn't be complete without more spells? A bad one, that's what. And thankfully, Arcana Exet provides them in the form of subpaths. Normally, when you start learning a magical path, you have access to free access spells. Spells you can choose from a list that have some generic effects. Depending on the path you gain the free access spell from, there might be certain spells you can't learn. What you can do instead is, when you're learning a magical path, you can choose to adopt a subpath through that path. Doing so eliminates some, or possibly all, of the free access spells you would get access to. But it grants you some more specialized spells, some of which are actually really cool, like the ones in the literature subpath. The new spells made available make up a nice section of this book, though they use a different sort of spell rating system that isn't quite explained in the core book. Here they give basic, intermediate, advanced, and arcane levels of casting, as opposed to extra levels of effect. This unfortunate idiosyncrasy is evidence of some of the problems that came about with the translation of this game. As I said earlier, the core rulebook is based on the first edition, but most of the Splat books are based on the second edition. I was able to find what appears to be a fan-compiled guide to the spells from the core book translated into this new style of formatting. It's called Book of Magic Core Exet. It doesn't have every spell, but it possesses most of them. For those it doesn't, I suggest using your best judgment. Summoners get a few new abilities and lists too. First and foremost, Invokers have more things they can form pacts with. The Great Beasts and the Eons. Functionally, they're not much different than the Arcana listed in the core book, so just think of this as an expanded spell list of sorts for them. One of the truly new things Invokers can use, however, are Incarnations. They're described as an invocation, since using one is similar to using the other. What changes, however, is that there are certain modifiers that make summoning an incarnation different. The end result is also somewhat different as well. The summoner temporarily becomes what they're calling upon. As a result, the difficulty of the summon is raised or lowered depending on how long the character wants it to last. Other modifiers affect the summoning as well, and these vary on a case-by-case basis determined by who is being summoned. One final note is that there's also 3 different affinity levels for summoning an incarnation. The stronger the affinity, the more and stronger powers you get, but the more difficult it is to summon them, in addition to there being a higher Xeon cost and level requirement. The last new toy for summoners is actually more useful for the other variety of summoner that brings other creatures into the world. They're referred to as Sheol, and they are basically a physical incarnation of magic, usually representing one of the different paths. Sheol have a much higher summoning cost than other creatures, to the effect of 10 times the normal Xeon cost, and they're summoned as if they're creatures 1 level higher than the summoner's level. The plus side to Sheol are this though: their abilities are tied to their master. As the person the Sheol is bound to levels up, the Sheol levels up as well. Additionally, mages are able to use their Sheol to cast spells through them, effectively allowing a mage to exist in 2 places at once when casting spells. Perhaps what is most interesting about Sheol is this though: a character doesn't necessarily need to be a summoner to have a Sheol bound to them. One person can summon the Sheol, and another can have it bound to them, though this raises the difficulty even further. One of the drawbacks to having a Sheol is this though: to bind the Sheol, whoever will be its master has to permanently lose 1 point of power. Otherwise, Sheol are a very handy thing to have, even if you're not a spellcaster or summoner. Psychics get some other things to add to their characters as well. First and foremost, they gain some additional disciplines, such as causality and electromagnetism, plus a few others. What's really worth talking about though is the mental patterns. These are specific frames of mind a character can have that affects their psychic powers. They cost development points to gain, but they cause a particular facet of a character's personality to start impacting their psychic powers, making certain kinds of powers easier to use at the cost of certain others being more difficult. A character can have 2 of these, so long as they're not the opposite of each other, and they're willing to pay a higher cost for the second one. If you decide that the disadvantage for a particular pattern is just too much to deal with though, you can always abandon it by paying its cancellation cost. The final thing listed in the Arcana Exet are rituals and grimoires, followed by a few optional rules. Rituals are the one thing in this book that is useful to all characters, regardless of type. They're spell-like effects that can be cast by any character that meets certain requirements. In most cases, these requirements are having your secondary abilities at a certain level, and for all of them, you'll require Occult as one of your secondary abilities. The cost of using a ritual is often time and Xeon, which makes them particularly less useful in combat or if you need quick results. Grimoires, on the other hand, are magical books. Not just books about magic, but books with magic written in them. Having them allows a character to cast spells from them as if they have the gift. And grimoires can also be used to further magical study, if you're using those rules. They also describe certain invocations and rituals as well. Basically, treat these like you would a magical item in any other game. Something to be coveted, and not to be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. The last bit of odds and ends are some clarifications of how certain rules work, as well as some optional rules for magical nodes, enchanted areas, and even magic infection. Basically, all ways that magic can affect the environment, and not always in a way that can be considered beneficial. So there we have it, Arcana Exet. It's actually a pretty short book, only 138 pages, but it's full of all kinds of goodies if you want to include them in a magic-centered game of Anima. It's definitely worth giving a read if you're a fan of Anima, and doubly so if you like your fantasy games to be full of magic. The only drawback is that Anima Beyond Fantasy's books have been out of print for a while, so you're not likely to find a copy of it for sale. So, with all that said, I am Aaron Dershadel, and I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, give me a thumbs up. And while we're at it, which one of these things that the Arcana Exet adds sounds most fun to you? Leave your answer in the comments.